Well, let's talk about Something for a moment. Of course, as many of you know, it has its genesis in the lyrics of another Apple artist.
Correct. So Apple, as you know, had formed a music company, among many other companies. That was one of the things they were trying to do after Brian Epstein died, is develop Apple, their own company. And Apple Music was auditioning new artists. And one of the artists who came in was a certain young man named James Taylor. And the song he auditioned with in front of George and Paul was a song called Something in the Way She Moves. And George liked the song, liked James Taylor, liked that opening line too, so.
And he made a mental note.
Yes, yes he did.
Now, you know, James Taylor years later would say, trying to make light of it, that he ends the song with the lyrics, I feel fine. So it was, you know, he was giving it right back. You know, this is one of those songs, right, that George Harrison had to fight for. It didn't just make it onto this record. He had to keep bringing it back.
Yeah, and in fact, he started writing it during the White Album session, so back in '68. And George, you know, it's probably a good point to talk about George because this album is so great for Harrison. Paul and John developed as songwriters with each other. They always had the other guy to bounce ideas off of. John would say, that's a stupid lyric, Paul. Paul would say, I've got a better melody. You know, they would work together. And even when they were writing separately, they still, I think, had this desire to impress the other person. Harrison, you know, any other band in the world, he would have been the lead songwriter, right? But he's competing with John and Paul. So trying to get his songs on albums and trying to get the attention of John and Paul, that's a hard thing to do in this group.
And there was a commercial aspect to it, too. So remember, until 1966 or so, the Beatles are still, and George Martin and Brian Epstein, are still very much concerned with becoming that most awful of phrases, a flash in the pan. They did not want to become a flash in the pan. They did not want to prove all of our parents right and become extinct. So George Martin was often the adjudicator of which songs made the albums, which songs, you know, got life in the studio. And he would frankly say the hotter hand was Lennon and McCartney. Mm-hmm. And so he was as guilty, perhaps more so, of keeping George Harrison in that junior status for a long time.
That's right. And unfortunately, and he regretted this later, I think, is he didn't spend enough time with George. He focused, John and Paul were budding songwriters, he focused on them. The other thing is that John and Paul, you know, always thought that when this whole rock and roll thing died, they would write for other people, you know, so they always thought of themselves as songwriters. And again, George Martin recognized that. So the fact that George Harrison has what I think are his two best songs, certainly two of his best songs on this album, shows that he was peaking just, unfortunately, as the Beatles were going to be ending their career. So,
right, and that kind of peaking that he was carrying out, we also hear on many of the other songs. He is just absolutely shining.
Yes, the guitar playing all the way through is incredible, and his harmonies with John and Paul all the way through are just wonderful.
Well, perhaps the most controversial song in the album, not perhaps, is Maxwell Silver Hammer. I was on Sirius XM recently with Alan Parsons, and we had a funny moment where the host began to sort of tear Maxwell Silver Hammer a new one, or in this case, an old one, since it's been kicked around for a long time. And Alan, who isn't particularly hilarious, just sort of looked at this guy deadpan, and he said, I very much like Maxwell Silver Hammer. And actually, Alan's a huge guy, so we all did at that point.
That's right, that's right. Well, I have to confess, I named my first son after this song because it's always been a favorite of mine. So I know not every Beatles fan feels the same way, but I did, of course, name my son after a serial killer, but that's a whole other different problem.
But it's a pataphysical
It is a
serial
pataphysical,
killer.
yes.
So it's like a learned, sophisticated, which would be a Freiman killer.
I'm sure it would be.
Well, this is a song that, of course, we know so well for the Moog synthesizer and how that made its way into the band.
So during the time between the Get Back sessions and Abbey Road really started in July and August. It started earlier, as Ken said, but the real sessions in July and August were when they put the album together. The Beatles were all working with other people. You know, John was working with Yoko, of course, but George, Paul, and Ringo were all working on other albums. Ringo plays on Leon Russell's first album. Paul is producing, you know, working with Badfinger and Mary Hopkins, and George Harrison's working with a bunch of people, including Jackie Lomax, who's going to be one of the first Apple artists. He's a soul artist, and he's in California, and he meets this guy named Bernie Krause, who is there to play Moog synthesizers on Jackie Lomax's first Apple album. And Bernie's a great guy, really super smart. He was one of the pioneers of modular synthesis, of playing the Moog. And George Harrison, who always loved new instruments, said, what is this thing? I need to know what this is. I need to learn how to play this. And spends a lot of time with Bernie, ultimately has one shipped to London, has Bernie come out and teach him how to use it, ultimately brings it to Abbey Road. And so this is the first album and only Beatles album that features the Moog synthesizer. And one last point I'll bring up, there was an album out. The Moog had been used by the Byrds, the Monkees, the Doors, but mostly as a kind of a sound effect. It made weird sounds. But this album called Switched on Bach. Anyone have that album? Yeah? So Switched on Bach was this album of Bach played with a Moog synthesizer, the old meets new. And it showed that the Moog could be this melodic instrument. And I think that went into the playing on Abbey Road, because most of the Moog sounds are playing melodic lines, simulating orchestral instruments, but in a definitely synthesizer way. And it's really, it works out great. And Maxwell has a couple different parts of the Moog on that.
It's interesting, too, that there wasn't a lot of photography that was carried out during Beatles sessions. As we all know, there's a paucity of photographs from all those great sessions, and much less video. But in any event, one of the days that was most heavily documented was Moog Day. Yep. You can see everybody, including George Martin, Jeff Emmerich's back in the team by now, John Kurlander, the tape op, they're all playing with it.
Yep, yep.
You can't talk about Maxwell Silverhammer either without discussing, of course, the tape that is making all the rounds at the moment. I'm speaking about the tape that was made on September 10th, 1969, involving Anthony Fawcett, who was John Lennon's assistant in 1968 through 70. And Anthony was asked to, of course, record one of their meetings after they had finished the album to talk about how they might find a path forward. And Maxwell Silverhammer gets a lot of play.
And why were they recording the meeting?
They were recording the meeting because Ringo wasn't there. He was ill, and they wanted to make sure they had a record of it. In fact, their last two meetings, they were missing a Beatle both times. Harrison missed the other one. But that's why they recorded it. And it's very interesting to hear this kind of almost clinical way John Lennon talks about Maxwell Silverhammer, which they call Maxwell at this point. They've spent a lot of time with it by now. And they're discussing why maybe they shouldn't have used it.